Tonight on Nova, from the skies over Germany, where B-17s relentlessly bombed the Nazi war machine, too high above the desert of Iraq, where fighter bombers use laser-guided weapons against Saddam Hussein. High-tech air power has become so prominent that experts now wonder, can bombing win a war?
Funding for NOVA is provided by Johnson & Johnson, the signature recognized around the world for commitment to quality healthcare products for the entire family. And Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.
On January 17, 1991, nearly 700 aircraft prepared to attack Iraq and Kuwait. This was the beginning of Operation Desert Storm, 6 months after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. It would be a war unlike any other, a war of high technology, fought mostly in the air, and bearing an eerie resemblance to a video game.
Laser coming on. Got the laser on. Holding the track and steady on the far corner. Roger.
Say call sign, calling back.
Good. 10 seconds.
Shell 4-1, I've got a Palio. I think that's wedged to the south.
4, 3, 2,
I'm out of my position
1.
for about 10
Should
miles.
be impact. Boom! Oh, yes! Coming right.
Both the Gulf War and the latest airstrikes in Iraq have demonstrated our new reliance on high-tech bombing. The Iraqis were especially stunned by the attacks 2 years ago, and so was the rest of the world, watching the briefings at home.
These first two will be F-111 deliveries using laser-guided bombs. This is a runway at an airfield halfway between Baghdad and Kuwait. The center of the runway is the end point. This is where the laser designator is pointed. This is taken at night with infrared sensors, and there the bomb goes off in the center of the runway.
In the Gulf War, the main coalition strategy was to use precision bombing to cripple Iraq's ability to fight before the ground offensive began. The primary target of the first airstrikes was the Iraqi capital.
Not everybody's familiar with Baghdad, but most people are familiar with Washington. Imagine, if you will, the Pentagon being hit, Congress being hit, the White House being hit, the AT&T building being hit, and then you wake up to all this noise and you reach over to turn on your lights, the lights don't come on because we've hit all the power plants surrounding the Washington area. You pick up the telephone and the telephone's dead, you can't talk to anybody. That's in effect what we were able to do and what we targeted in downtown Baghdad.
12-1-13-2-22-8, reading normal.
What used to take months to accomplish in previous wars now took hours.
Gulf 3 is 13-2-21-5, reading normal.
Long before the ground offensive began, the air campaign was destroying Iraq's ability to attack or even defend itself.
What we really were trying to do in many ways was to take away Saddam Hussein's ability to see. So in that way we took away the radar, which was the most important sight available to him. We took away his ability to hear from the standpoint of having communications coming into him from a variety of sources to tell him what was going on. And we took away his communications, his outbound communications, so that he could not tell his forces what to do in any sort of a coherent way.
To carry out the coalition strategy, F-111 fighter bombers used laser-guided bombs to knock out targets deep in Iraqi territory. The F-117 Nighthawk, better known as Stealth, bombed Baghdad at will without ever being picked up by enemy radar. Satellites traveling thousands of miles overhead identified the smallest Iraqi targets down to a single jeep. Planes crammed with sophisticated radar systems continually tracked enemy aircraft.
Right now we've got an possible Iraqi.
Exhilarated by the success of the high-tech air war, some in the military called it a revolution.
It's revolutionary from the sense of the very few number of bombs that were required in order to achieve an enormous amount of very, very focused, precise destruction. It is revolutionary in that it was the first war in which single airplanes were able to fly through to their targets and accomplish what in the past either could not have been accomplished at all or would have taken literally thousands of airplanes to accomplish.
Have we entered a new era in which bombing alone can win a war? If so, modern technology may have finally caught up with nearly a century of theory, with profound implications for the future of warfare.
Bulldog Bug 2-1. Try Red Crown, Emerald 26. Copy.
This is where the history of bombing really begins. Not in the air, but on the ground, in a war mired in the mud. Out of the bloody stalemate of World War I was born a new theory of air power. "11 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, the armies of the First World War battered each other from trenches spread over hundreds of miles. It was a kind of mass suicide, each army unable to outflank the other, locked in a deadly embrace. A visitor to the front would have been hard-pressed to find evidence of the revolution in aviation that already had begun. Of the 1 million casualties the Allies suffered in the first 3 months of the war, virtually none were inflicted from the air. But that was about to change.
The Germans believe that bombs over London will weaken the will of a populace. A giant Zeppelin leaves its base for a night raid. London is in darkness. Searchlights scan the air. Signals scream out their warnings. Take cover.
Newsreels testified later to the great psychological effect of the first Zeppelin raids in 1915. But the airships were filled with inflammable gas and made easy targets. It wasn't long before the airplane became the bomber of choice. Airplanes were faster, more maneuverable, and harder to hit from the ground. From a high-flying plane, the whole world seemed a target. Railroads, lines of communications, factories, every street and every house, civilians as well as soldiers. Military theorists distinguished between two kinds of bombing: strategic bombing and tactical bombing. Tactical bombing was used at the front in direct support of ground operations. But strategic bombing was carried out far from the battle lines, often deep in enemy territory. Its object was to cripple the enemy's ability to wage war by destroying both its resources and its will to fight. An early proponent of strategic bombing, Giulio Due of Italy, wrote that if long-range bombing could create intolerable conditions on the home front, the enemy must admit defeat, no matter what the status of its ground forces. Due's critics called it the Due theory of frightfulness. In the early part of the First World War, the planes themselves seemed unequal to the task. They could carry only a few small bombs and had limited range. But improvements in technology came rapidly under the pressure of war. This German bomber had more powerful engines than its predecessors and could carry up to 1,000 pounds of bombs. In the spring of 1917, it was put to the test. Its destination was London.
It was a beautiful day, a beautiful June day. And suddenly in the sky there appeared this formation. And they looked up and saw these things, and some said, what a beautiful sight this was. The target was Liverpool Street Station, and these bombs started to drop. Nearly 600 casualties, over 160 dead. And that this could happen in the heart of the empire. This was something that shook the British down to their roots.
Britain's Royal Air Corps was quick to respond. Planes were readied for bombing raids on German cities. Pilots had now become the war's most glamorous heroes, and yet the damage they inflicted in their still primitive airplanes was only an infinitesimal fraction of the war's total destruction. The worst bombing raids killed fewer people than a few seconds of fighting on the Western Front. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, an Ohio farm boy named George Cronin was sent to Italy to learn how to fly. For Cronin and his friends, bombing seemed little more than a hunting trip.
A day work would consider getting up and drinking your chicory coffee and told to go out and cruise a railroad until you came to a station. We were cautioned to not bomb civilians per se, just trying to kill civilians. That was not thought about at all. If they got in the way, it was too bad. And I'm sure of the early bombing was to try to do strategic good with it, not just viciously trying to kill people.
Armed with a few bombs, a map, and a compass, pilots would take to the sky each day. But Cronin's sense of adventure soon faded as the reality of war hit home. 1 out of every 3 men in his squadron died in training while learning how to fly the notoriously unstable bombers. On the Western Front, the life expectancy of an average pilot was just 3 weeks. And there were other victims everywhere.
We had not thought very much of what war was until you begin to see wounded coming home from the front, for example. You begin to get really shocked, and the thing wasn't all fun like you had thought it was going to be. You had to pay a price for it.
As the war drew to a close, strategic bombing was just beginning to demonstrate its potential. But the generals on both sides were more interested in using planes for reconnaissance or for tactical bombing to support troops at the front. The British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, called the results of strategic bombing comparatively unimportant. This, after all, was a war fought mostly on the ground. It seemed only natural that military thinking continued to reflect the experience of the infantry, not the Air Force. And when the war was finally over and all the bodies buried, the last thing an exhausted world wanted to hear was the need for more air power. But even as a peace treaty was being signed in Versailles, a few men argued that now was the time to prepare for the next conflict, which, despite all hopes, was bound to come.
line, Washington, D.C., December 17th, 1925.
In the 1920s, the chief American proponent of strategic bombing was a World War I flying ace, the ill-fated Billy Mitchell.
Since his return from France, he had insisted that an airplane could sink any surface ship. Engines were started, and the 1st Provisional Air Brigade took off for a mission which was to test the future of military aviation. A perfect hit. This was expert pinpoint bombing.
Using obsolete ships as targets, General Mitchell set out on a one-man campaign to convince the Army that airplanes were a powerful offensive weapon. But Mitchell was a tactless man and made powerful enemies. When he accused the high command of incompetence, he was court-martialed and suspended from duty for 5 years. It would take the rise of fascism to make a prophet of Billy Mitchell. Fascist governments in Italy and Germany rebuilt their military forces in the 1930s. Planes were bigger and faster, and their bombs were more powerful. As the world slipped closer to war, the idea that long-range strategic bombing could help win it seemed more credible. The Italians sent this modern air force into action against Ethiopians, armed with spears and ancient rifles. The Germans sent bombers to Spain to aid the fascists in the Civil War. This time, military strategists took notice.
Here are the first pictures of Barcelona, Loyalist capital, shattered by the worst air bombardment in Europe's history. Filmed even as the New York of Catalonia trembled in terror of new raids after 18 successive sky attacks in 2 days, these scenes show war's horror in Spain's largest city. Europe's nightmare come true, a metropolis which refuses to yield, laid waste from the air.
In Paris, civil defense drills were held to prepare for air raids. The greatest fear was of poison gas bombs dropped by enemy planes. In the U.S., MGM produced a film called Terror in the Night, reflecting the widespread anxiety about bombing.
Showers of strangling gas bombs rained down. Film fiction that may someday be a fact.
It was only a matter of time before the whole world shared the nightmare. On September 1st, 1939, Germany sent 1,600 planes into the air. The invasion of Poland had begun. German dive bombers were brutally effective in the lightning-fast war called Blitzkrieg. Designed to swoop down upon their prey, the bombers met little resistance. As Polish forces were routed by the German army on the ground, the Luftwaffe hit thousands of strategic targets, rail centers, road junctions, bridges, airfields. Poland's ability to fight back was destroyed. When the people of Warsaw refused to surrender, the Germans used strategic bombing to try to crush their will to fight. Thousands of civilians were killed. Warsaw was shattered. But how well would bombing work against a more powerful enemy with better defenses? In the summer and fall of 1940, the Luftwaffe was determined to find out over London. The city was raided for 57 consecutive nights. 13,000 tons of bombs were dropped. An American reporter, Quentin Reynolds, sent back this report to a still neutral United States.
Dr. Paul Joseph Gibbles said recently that the nightly air raids have had a terrific effect upon the morale of the people of London. The good doctor is absolutely right. Today the morale of the people is higher than ever before. They are fused together, not by fear, but by a surging spirit of courage the like of which the world has never known.
One of the main tenets of strategic bombing had been shaken. The targeting of civilians had strengthened their will to fight, not weakened it. And the bombing did not go unanswered. British fighters shot down bombers faster than the Germans could produce them. The Royal Air Force now prepared its own campaign of strategic bombing. Leading the effort was Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris.
There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. Germany, clinging more and more desperately to her widespread conquest, and even seeking foolishly for more, will make a most interesting initial experiment.
At first, the British tried what's known as precision or pinpoint bombing, identifying and destroying specific targets like factories and power plants. The only way to find targets that small was to fly during the day. But in daylight, the British bombers could be shot down more easily than at night. So the British switched to night raids to cut down their losses. But soon, a new problem arose.
In the summer of 1941, they do an intensive photo reconnaissance report on how well they're doing. They're trying to determine how close they're actually coming to the targets that they want to hit. And the results are really very depressing. It turns out that only about 1 in 5 bombers is getting within 5 miles of the target, which is really quite a shock. So what they decide is that the one target that they can acquire with consistency are German cities.
In briefing rooms all over the country, station commanders disclose the big secret.
Now, the target is an old friend to many of you. It's the city of Cologne. The route is almost direct. I'll show it to you.
1,000 British bombers attacked the German city. This was known as area bombing, with massive destruction and huge civilian casualties. Within 90 minutes, the center of Cologne was in ruins. British bombers hit one German city after another. But as in London, civilian morale held. Factories were rebuilt or moved. Between early 1942 and July 1944, German war production tripled.
We thought that the Germans were very efficient, of course, that they had fully mobilized. Well, it turns out that the German economy did not mobilize on a wartime footing until 1943. So we were bombing the German economy, destroying their production facilities, but the production kept going up because they were simply mobilizing the slack in their economy that we hadn't realized was there.
By the summer of 1942, the United States had joined the air war. This documentary was produced to honor the men of the 8th Air Force, based in England. It focused on the story of one bomber, the Memphis Belle. Despite the experience of the British, the Americans were committed to daylight precision bombing. They argued that targeting vital industrial and transportation centers that were difficult to hit at night was the best way to disrupt the Nazi war machine. And they thought they had the means to do it right. The B-17, a new bomber designed to survive enemy firepower. It was so heavily armed, it was called the Flying Fortress.
Now the enemy knows the path of your approach and walls that path with a flak barrage. But you fly right through it. Flak so thick you can get out and walk on it.
The B-17 was equipped with an improved bomb sight that gave the bombardier control of the plane during the final approach to the target.
Now one pointer on the bomb sight moves toward another stationary pointer. The instant they touch, bombs away.
The bomb sight's admirers claimed that it could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel.
Watch that fighter coming in the 3 o'clock.
He's coming in a half roll. Pull her up, Chief. Pull her up. Hurry.
Daylight raids by American bombers continued through 1942 and 43 with frighteningly high losses.
They're coming in, Scotty.
Get that ball turret on him.
A crew had only a 1 in 3 chance of surviving its full complement of 25 missions.
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock.
The Memphis Belle was one of the lucky ones.
The wheels of the Memphis Belle come back to the soil of England for the 25th time.
In 1943, the U.S. targeted factories which produced the ball bearings for German fighter planes. The hope was to ground the Luftwaffe in time for the Allies' land invasion of Europe. On August 17th, 376 American bombers flew toward the factories of Schweinfurt. But here, a strategy that was supposed to save Allied lives cost dearly.
And I'd say Schweinfurt was the roughest mission. We fought for 7 hours and 20 minutes. We took twice the amount of ammunition that we should have taken on the ship. Didn't have a bullet left when we got back to base. We had to turn around, come straight back, just in and out the same line. And you could look at the route that you had to follow by the fires of the 60 forts that went down in that raid. We lost 600 men. I would say overall for the theater, we lost 5,500 4-engine airplanes and 3,000 escort fighters. And we lost 44,000 men, 26,000 killed. That was 1/10 of all Americans killed in World War II. In other words, 1 man out of 10 that died was an 8th Air Force man.
The Allies worked out a program of around-the-clock bombing. The Americans pounded German targets during the day, while the British bombed them at night. Within little more than a week, the RAF killed 43,000 people in Hamburg alone. But the German economy was so strong, it withstood the repeated blows. The Allies pursued every possible technological improvement to increase the accuracy of bombing and safeguard planes and crews. Long-range fighters were built to protect bombers deep in enemy territory. To help plan missions, flying weather stations supplied data from which 8 major weather maps were drawn each day. And even in bad weather, Allied bombers had a technological advantage.
The weather bears out the forecast. Clouds, heavy overcast, all the way to the target. If the enemy took comfort in the thought that the bombardier sees nothing more than this, they were living in a fool's paradise. For at a calculated instant, tons of high explosives would be sent away to the target, aimed by the miracle of radar.
A new onboard radar system utilized short radio wavelengths to find targets from the air. But what happened after the bombs were dropped? Every bombardier knew that terms like precision and pinpoint were relative.
Well, a dumb bomb, after it's released, you have no control of it at all. It's just on nature, which would be the air mass itself. The different stratas of air that are moving in different directions and different velocities, the density of the air that you have to travel through, the humidity in the air. There are a lot of variables within the air itself that can cause that to vary. And the construction of the bomb. If they, in process of loading, happen to nick one of the fins, for instance, plus the air of the bombardier himself.
Lack of accuracy meant that even when civilians weren't targeted, they were often the victims of strategic bombing. Each pilot dealt with a moral dilemma in his own way.
It was a strictly impersonal sort of thing. As far as I was concerned, they told us what to bomb, and we did our best to bomb it. Now, the fallout, which may have been civilian casualties, at 23,000 feet, you are aware that you perhaps drop bombs on women and children, which probably we did, not deliberately, but inadvertently. I really have no guilt about that. The alternative was Hitler ruling the world.
In the final stages of the war, American factories produced a staggering amount of planes and bombs. Only a great industrial power like the United States could sustain a long campaign of strategic bombing. In 1944, the U.S. and Britain produced 44,000 planes to Germany's 2,000. This was a war of attrition, with the Allies trying to batter the enemy into submission with sheer numbers of machines and men. After the invasion of France in June 1944, the Allied effort was firmly focused on the ground war. This was how the conflict in Europe would end, battle by battle, mile by mile, until the German army collapsed. As strategic bombing was overshadowed by the infantry's advance, critics began to ask whether it had really fulfilled its promise.
Well, it depends on what you expected of bombing at the outset. If you expected it to contribute to victory in Europe, you certainly have to be happy with the results. One of the important campaigns in the later part of World War II was the campaign against transportation and communications targets. It makes it very difficult, and towards the end almost impossible, for the German army to prosecute its campaign on the ground. German supplies are so interrupted, their ability to move men around the theater has become so restricted that it really has a very important impact on the ultimate outcome of the war. If you expected bombing to win the war on its own, then naturally you're going to be disappointed.
Our Superfort raids on Japan are swiftly being intensified as more and more of the B-29s roll from the assembly line.
If bombing's effectiveness had increased in Europe, it seemed to make a quantum leap in the war with Japan. The U.S. used the new B-29 bomber to carry out a series of attacks on major population centers. This was area bombing at its most ferocious. The goal was to wreak as much destruction as possible, as quickly as possible, to bring Japan to its knees. In March 1945, an incendiary raid engulfed 16 square miles of Tokyo in flames. 80,000 people lay dead. 1 million were left homeless. But morale held. Japan rejected all calls for surrender. It would take the most stunning escalation in the history of bombing to make the government change its mind. On August 6th, a B-29 called Enola Gay headed toward the city of Hiroshima. Cradled in its bomb bay was the embodiment of Dewey's theory of frightfulness, the atomic bomb.
When we came in and dropped the weapon and made the turn, I did it as fast as possible, and I didn't much more than get the airplane around and the wings level, and I said, oh boy, it's over with, and here we are almost 50 seconds away, the bomb didn't explode before it was supposed to, and so forth and so on, so everything's normal. I didn't much more than get that thought out of my mouth, then all of a sudden, looking forward and a little bit up through all of this glass here in the front, the sky in front of me lit up to the most brilliant blue hue you've ever imagined in your life.
80,000 people were killed. Again, Japan was asked to surrender. Again, it refused.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid manyfold, and the end is not yet. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
3 days after the Hiroshima blast, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. 40,000 more people died. The following day, the Japanese sued for peace. Here, finally, was bombing that could win a war. At the dawn of the nuclear age, the world woke up to a terrible new reality. In an air raid lasting only a few minutes, this could just as easily be London, or Paris, or even Washington. The head of the U.S. Air Force, General Carl Spaatz, quickly began to plan for the future.
We must maintain an adequate, well-trained, fully equipped Air Force of the kind necessary to use these new weapons quickly and effectively. During World War II, America's air potential came of age. That process of growth took time, but we must now realize that never again will we have time for such expansion.
Almost as soon as the hot war was over, the Cold War began. Boeing built hundreds of long-range B-50 bombers that could carry atomic weapons all the way to a new enemy, the Soviet Union, which was building its own nuclear arsenal.
Today, science is providing us with more devastating explosives and with intercontinental bombers capable of carrying them direct to the enemy nations from existing American bases.
But in Korea, the world learned an important lesson about the nuclear age. Because no one dared to use atomic weapons, wars would still be fought on the ground with conventional arms. And they would still be long and bitter. Bombing would still be carried out with conventional bombs. It would often be inaccurate and would stiffen, not weaken, the enemy's will to fight. But that wasn't the worst of it from the Air Force's perspective.
The air commanders had not anticipated the type of restrictions that were going to exist in the Korean War. Virtually all were combat veterans of World War II, in which they had just fought a war for unconditional surrender. Korea was really a very limited struggle in which our means of applying weaponry was limited and confined because we did not want the war to evolve into a general nuclear war against the Soviet Union. We could not attack targets within 12 miles of the Soviet border, the part of the Soviet Union that touched North Korea. That was off limits as well. And then we had other prohibitions on attacking. For instance, there was one massive hydroelectric facility near the Chinese border that was off limits that we could not attack.
And then came Vietnam.
U.S. fighter bombers continue to step up the air war in Vietnam in a series of heavy attacks on Viet Cong positions. It's the biggest number of raids in a single day since November last year. Among the targets, railroad lines, transformer stations, supply camps, and enemy convoys.
The war in Vietnam would prove even more frustrating for air commanders. High-speed fighter bombers were used repeatedly to hit strategic targets in North Vietnam. The Air Force's heaviest bomber, the B-52, carried 108 conventional bombs and pounded the country again and again. Nothing seemed to work well.
The problems that you had in Vietnam were that we were basically fighting an infantry force that didn't present very attractive targets for bombing, that the supply lines that we were attacking were basically trails in the jungle. You had a lot of jungle cover, you had a lot of bad weather, and ultimately we were looking at the narrow end, the small end of a real big logistical funnel, that we couldn't bomb the production facilities that were supporting North Vietnam because they were in China and the Soviet Union.
Once more, the limitations of Vietnam are not anticipated by air commanders, and I would argue perhaps by political leaders as well. Once more, in Vietnam, we find ourselves fighting a communist ally of the Soviet Union and now of the Chinese, and we do not want the war to evolve into a larger conflict, and that is a great reason for Lyndon Johnson's restrictions on the air war against North Vietnam.
But no matter how ineffective strategic bombing was in Vietnam, it did provide an important breakthrough: the smart bomb. A smart bomb is basically a conventional bomb with a laser-seeking sensor, a guidance mechanism, and steering fins attached to the nose. A pencil-thin beam of invisible laser light is shown onto the target from the aircraft. When the bomb is released, it will steer itself toward the reflected light.
Well, after we built the first dozen, the thought was put together that we'd take a special crew and a few special airplanes and deploy to northern Thailand and take 50 of them over and see if we can make them work in the theater. And you got to realize we're talking vintage mid-1966, and here are these engineers and other assorted military people who've shown up in an operational theater with a laser-guided something, and of course it immediately got looked at like it was a Buck Rogers idea, and so it had to prove itself very early on over there, and it did. It knocked down some bridges, which got attention, and then things began to move on.
25 years later, on the second night of the Gulf War, an F-111 returns from a combat mission over Iraq after dropping 2 laser-guided smart bombs.
How'd it go? Real good. Real good. Just like it was planned. Real smooth. Tell us about it. What happened? We took off out of here, climbed up medium altitude, went across the border, and found the airfield, the Dempy target, and put our bombs right through what we wanted to put them through.
Just like a training sortie, almost. My heart didn't think it was, but it went good. It went good.
As soon as the flight crew goes off for debriefing, the ground crew readies 2 more smart bombs for another sortie. The Air Force hopes that the war in the Gulf will finally erase the lingering frustrations and doubts about bombing's effectiveness. This time, all the signs are good. The enemy doesn't hide in the jungle, but sits in the desert. The United States is not bitterly divided over the need to fight.
9, 8, 7.
The end of the Cold War has eliminated fears of World War III.
2, 1, launch.
The strategy of terrorizing civilians with bombing has been abandoned, keeping direct civilian casualties low and making the air war more politically acceptable at home. And perhaps most importantly, the planes and weapons being used are finally sophisticated enough to make precision bombing work.
Air power technology has finally caught up with air power theory. We've had theorists around since the days of Mitchell and Duhay that have described what we did, but they didn't have the tools and the systems capable of achieving that. For example, in World War II, it took 9,000 bombs to get a significant amount of damage on a given target that it took 200 bombs to accomplish in Vietnam. We were able to do that today with one bomb in one aircraft.
No plane symbolizes the Gulf War better than the F-117 Stealth. Although officially a fighter, it was used here as a light bomber. For 15 years, the existence of the plane was a closely guarded secret. It carries only 2 smart bombs with a range of just 1,000 miles. But the F-117 does have something that no other plane has, a skin that absorbs and dissipates radar, making it almost impossible to detect. The Stealth could be sent out alone at night without any fighter escort to the most heavily defended areas of Iraq. The impact of the F-117 was out of all proportion to its numbers and the amount of time it spent in action. Although the planes flew only 2% of the war's total sorties, they bombed 30% of all strategic targets. Not a single Stealth was hit by enemy fire.
I don't think there's any doubt that Stealth has revolutionized not only aerial warfare, but all of warfare. And I'm sure at some point in time, there'll be some way to counter, to some effect, stealth technology. But I think that misses the point. All the existing conventional defenses now are built around radar technology, which is defeated by stealth.
In the last stages of the war, more than 200,000 Iraqi soldiers surrendered. Over 30,000 lay dead. Total coalition casualties were less than 500. The ground offensive required only a few days. To many, it was air power that deserved the credit.
The answer is unequivocal that bombing won this war. And it won this war not because it was in the desert, not because it was against Iraq, but because the technology had come together, which allowed us to hit and to knock out those things on which any enemy depends. The communications, the command and control, the electricity. It is not an anomalous win. It is a pattern for the future.
But other experts are not so sure. One estimate is that half of all guided weapons landed within a few feet of their targets, an astonishing record compared to previous wars. But not all of these weapons actually destroyed their targets.
I think there's no question that the precision-guided bombing is more sophisticated now than it's ever been before. I think it is still probably inaccurate to say that this is pinpoint accuracy that you've got. You can just take the thing out with one shot. That has always been a hope It's sometimes been advertised. It's very difficult to achieve.
763 is up.
Not every bomb is smart either. In fact, only 8% of the munitions dropped in the war were guided.
Departure Gulf 35 out of 1,000 for 4,000.
Most planes aren't built to handle smart bombs, and the expense of using them is enormous. A fire control system on an aircraft with smart bombs can cost $2 million alone, and each of the bombs is 10 times more expensive than an unguided one. Coalition airplanes would use more than $500 million of munitions in just 5 weeks, and the cost of damaged or lost aircraft would run into the billions. So the world may not be able to afford too many more high-tech air wars, especially if both sides are equally well equipped and the fighting drags on. There is also the matter of where the Gulf War was fought. Did the Middle Eastern terrain make for too easy a test of strategic bombing's effectiveness?
There is a way in which you can think of the Middle East as a perfect cockpit for air combat. One quickly thinks of the effectiveness of the Israeli Air Force and their repeated engagements. As a consequence, I think it's easy to assess that air power was decisive in the Persian Gulf War and may not be quite so decisive next time round because conditions will be different, including the place where we fight the war.
Well, I think one of the real breakthroughs that you've seen in the Gulf War is the extensive use of precision-guided munitions against targets that they're effective against. You had precision-guided munitions during the Vietnam War, but with a few exceptions, bridges and that sort of thing, there just really weren't that many targets that an accurate bomb was going to make a difference against. Whereas in the Iraq War, you had air defense facilities, you had individual tanks, you had lots of bridges, lots of things that precision-guided bombs can go after. So the real question in the future is going to be, we've got all these precision weapons, do we have precision targets?
There is also the question of what winning actually means. Wars are not fought in a vacuum. They have political goals and political consequences. Bombing helped drive Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait, but it couldn't topple his government. For some, this made it a less than total success. And finally, it shouldn't be forgotten that the air war was part of a much larger land, sea, and air offensive. It wasn't until the coalition ground forces swept into Kuwait that the Iraqi defenses crumbled. Few people are more aware of the interdependence of all the branches of the military than the man who directed the air war in the Gulf.
I don't think that people can say that bombing alone will win a war. The question really is, what kind of a war are you fighting? The terrain, the enemy, the political objectives? What are all the factors involved? And within that, you need a land, sea, and air campaign that all complements itself into an overall win.
Good countdown now.
Having said that, I don't think there's any doubt that air power technology has finally caught up with air power theory, and that air can be a very decisive element in any war.
Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, impact. Oh! Nice, very big, very big. We're going home. Pretty bad.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. And Johnson & Johnson, the signature recognized around the world for commitment to quality healthcare products for the entire family. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.